When I hear someone say a golden age is ending, I usually think change is happening and they don't like it. I'm Ronald the Rules Lawyer, and there is a stir in the tabletop role playing game community around a statement posted by an author and historian, Ben Riggs. It is titled, "The Golden Age of TTRPGs is Dead." And Ben Riggs, I actually have his book, Slaying the Dragon, about the history of the downfall of TSR, which originally published Dungeons and Dragons, and I actually quite enjoyed it. He interviewed dozens of people directly involved in the development of Dungeons and Dragons in the 70s and 80s and 90s. I'll leave a link and a thumbnail of Dave Thomavor's video that quickly goes over the blunders TSR made that are covered in his book. I did think one flaw of the book was focusing only on TSR's tactical mistakes and not looking at the overall conditions facing the TTRPG industry in the 80s and 90s that were the context for TSR making a set of desperate moves. That losing sight of the bigger picture, I think, presages what we'll see in this article. First, to introduce myself, I am Ronald, the Rules Lawyer. I am a lawyer who has been game mastering the last 14 years, Pathfinder and D&D, and I ran an after-school middle school class. I mainly cover Pathfinder 2e on my channel, but also I've been covering the history of Dungeons and Dragons and looking into other tabletop role-playing games. Support my Patreon. It allows me to continue making videos. I don't make money as a lawyer. If that doesn't make sense to you, check out the video whose thumbnail is now up on the screen. You get early access to videos and exclusive content. Okay, so first I want to give credit to Dungeons and Discourse for putting out an excellent video covering this article. I'll leave a link and thumbnail. It inspired me to make my own. So what does Ben Riggs' article say? Well, obviously that the golden age of TTRPGs is dead, and also that the doom of our time approaches. He has a predilection for dramatic language. He begins by talking about the explosion of interest in tabletop role-playing games. Why there's a greater interest? He only credits Stranger Things and actual plays like Critical Role. This influx of new players, naturally playing Dungeons and Dragons as a first game, then discovered a vibrant and thrumming TTRPG industry where there was a D20 fantasy family of games dominated by D&D 5e, but rich with other games published under the OGL. That's the Open Gaming License that allows third-party publishers to make other material supporting Dungeons and Dragons and also derivative systems. This, he argues, has made it possible for other companies besides Hasbro to succeed because they have a common pool of customers, the D&D 5e market, that they can make product for. He says that the Open Gaming License scandal at the beginning of 2023 prompted these companies to move away from the OGL and start self-publishing their own systems in order to prevent Wizards of the Coast ever threatening their businesses ever again. And the crowdfunding campaigns these competitors to D&D have made have been successful. With these publishers no longer supporting the dominant system in the market and marketing their own systems, this, he says, will lead to division, faction, and balkanization. He makes an analogy to the 1990s, and his book is about the downfall of TSR, where TSR published a plethora of campaign settings that fractured their own market. Having split up their own market, any new thing that TSR published for any given campaign setting sold a fraction of the number sold of the original campaign setting. And he says this is what's happening again. He has a set of predictions. He says that the companies will have declining revenue over time, interest in tabletop role-playing games will plateau, no longer grow, and he says that tabletop role-playing games will become less diverse as it becomes even harder to make money in a TTRPG community broken into factions. And he has a conclusion, a recommendation that a lot of people commenting on this article have not caught. He says that this can be avoided if either a group of publishers coalesce around a single system, or something truly inconceivable, something like giving 6th edition D&D an OGL or putting the rules in the Creative Commons. So I have a number of things to say about this. I disagree with it, but I'll break down my disagreement with a number of points. First, he doesn't define what a golden age is, and when you use a term, you want to be on the same page as your audience and not just assume people have the same definition as you. This makes us all have to imply what he means by a golden age, and the closest I think is in this paragraph. He says, "This influx of gamers, the growth of people into the hobby, created a rising tide that lifted all boats. Novice gamers started out playing D&D 5e, yes, but went on to discover other great games. Because of the OGL, countless companies and designers could make money creating for D&D 5e. Because of the increasing number of gamers, even strange, freaky, or weird TTRPG ideas could find an audience. Have you heard of Apollo 47 Technical Manual, the RPG? He also says that the hobby will become less diverse as it becomes harder to make money in the industry. So for Ben Riggs, we have a golden age if people are able to create, say, mid or large companies publishing tabletop role-playing games. First thing to say is that this is not everyone's definition of a golden age. Many people in the old school Renaissance would beg to differ and call the 1970s the golden age of Dungeons and Dragons, before TSR became corporate and before people started making lots of money. Also, he kind of glosses over what's causing this influx of gamers in the first place. Sure, he does mention Critical Role and Stranger Things, but he doesn't go deeper than that, and we'll get back to that. His argument is that if the vast majority of people are not playing Dungeons & Dragons, not just any game, but Dungeons & Dragons, because he does highlight the importance of D&D's brand name recognition, then you can't build a business around TTRPGs, whether that's support material for 5e or your own freaky space game. And it's here I'll point out a contradiction in his argument. He says that one game needs to dominate the industry for there to be more diversity and presence of other games. But also fundamentally, what's good for business isn't always what's good for people who pay money to those businesses. He's focused on the businesses and not the experience of the players in the hobby. He even says that maybe every single one of these new TTRPGs is going to be amazing. He says in passing, as if that's secondary, before saying the problem is that the TTRPG business is devilishly difficult. I don't know if D&D 5e is Ben Riggs' favorite system, but it may not be for other people. If they were prompted by the OGL crisis to find a different system that they and their groups prefer, then it's hard to say that a golden age has ended for them. He goes on, the death of the OGL and the creation of these games, referring to the new competitors to D&D, has fundamentally changed the industry in such a way that it will be harder for these companies to make money in the future. Okay, there's two things to rebut here. First, the OGL didn't die. In fact, the community, we successfully defended it a year ago when we raised hell and forced Hasbro's hand. D&D 5e's basic rules are now in the Creative Commons. We didn't win nothing. He says that in 6th edition, the new edition coming out in 2024, there is no hint of an OGL for whatever that game will be. He later calls that possibility truly inconceivable. First of all, I want to distinguish myself from those who would slam him here and say 100% that Wizards of the Coast is going to put the new edition rules in a Creative Commons or in an OGL because they said so. We should know by now not to trust what WOTC says. But we also are not 100% sure that they won't do that. I think a more likely scenario, my prediction, and I could be wrong, we'll see, is that Wizards of the Coast wants to avoid the same firestorm that they created a year ago, and we'll see what they can exploit by only putting the basic rules, a subset of the rules, in an SRD as part of aggressively monetizing a digital version of the game. We just don't know. But back to the death of the OGL. The companies, Kobold Press, MCDM, that are publishing these new systems, they decided to go ahead and do that even after the OGL was defended. They could have still published supplemental material for D&D under the Creative Commons. What happened was not that the OGL died. What happened was that major competitors left it, and on top of that, they succeeded. Sure, follow-up crowdfunding projects for things that are not the core books of the system will not make as much money, but they never do. And these also aren't publicly traded companies that have to appease investors and have a constant increase in profit every quarter. The only scenario I see where these and other publishers flock back to creating support material for Dungeons & Dragons is if Wizards of the Coast publishes a new edition that addresses a lot of the issues with 5e and is new and exciting. Just as 3rd edition in the year 2000 brought a lot of people back into the D&D fold. But with a new edition looking like it will be what many D&D players are calling an ERRATA, that is likely not going to happen. So yeah, a good deal of these publishers don't want to be billionaires. They want to make a living doing something they're passionate about. And this statement, I think, characterizes companies as large as Paizo down to whoever published the Apollo 47 technical manual. And I doubt that the publisher of that manual did it to make a fortune, or did it only because there was a large influx of players playing D&D 5th edition. Passionate people will continue to make their games. What's new, however, is that it's become increasingly likely that you can make a pretty penny while being independent from WOTC. Why? Because of the OGL crisis making it so that some part of the D&D 5e market has decided to move away from Wizards of the Coast, as reflected by the success of these recent crowdfunding campaigns. They're trying other systems, or playing 5e still, or some clone of 5e, while not wanting to pay another dime to Wizards of the Coast. Now, I don't claim this is a majority of the previous D&D 5e market. I don't have the data. However, it is a significant amount and enough for people to make a healthy living off of as independent publishers. This also speaks to a new factor, which I don't think Ben Riggs acknowledges, which is that crowdfunding and the rise of crowdfunding in the last 15 years now minimizes risks for smaller businesses. You no longer have to guess what the market wants and sell your house before publishing and putting in all the expenditures to publish a book. And we also live in an age in which consumers can now directly through open playtests participate in the design and improvement of games while they're still being designed. Now, someone correct me if I'm wrong, but when Paizo came out with the open playtest for Pathfinder 1st edition in 2008, it may have been the first of its kind, and now such practices are commonplace. This not only improves the games, but also makes these ventures less risky for these publishers, since they're able to have these direct lines of communication and are able to improve their games and make it what their customers want. Now to what I think is the most persuasive part of Ben Riggs' argument, given his background as a historian, his argument that what's happening now happened before with the fracturing of the D&D market in the 1990s. He talks about how TSR published a dozen campaign settings and fractured their own market, and he covered that in his book, which, again, I quite liked. And it's absolutely true that that's what happened. In fact, the first time I heard about this was from the CEO of Paizo, Lisa Stevens. She was the employee for Wizards of the Coast who came in 1997 when they bought TSR, who studied the books and concluded that splitting the customer base was the number one reason TSR went out of business. Ben Riggs says that is now happening again. He says, instead of countless companies working to make your 5e game better, they are now asking you to become MCDM, or Darrington Press, or Paizo, or D&D 6e players. We are entering an era of division, faction, and balkanization. To me, that sounds like healthy capitalism, not dominated by a near monopoly. Ben Riggs seems to identify the success of Wizards of the Coast with the success of the industry as a whole. He says, let's look at MCDM's recent efforts from the point of view of Wizards of the Coast. It is all ruin, disaster, and calamity. Master communicator and D&D fanatic Matt Colville is asking his 439,000 subscribers to stop playing D&D and play his game instead. He asks us to look at it from the point of view of Wizards of the Coast and not from these other publishers. This idea that if Wizards of the Coast is unhappy, it's necessarily bad, kind of reminds me of the theory behind trickle-down economics, the theory that we all benefit when the rich get richer. I also have to say that the use of the word balkanization is objectionable. It's almost always used in an unserious and hyperbolic way. There haven't been genocides, and I would say that there haven't even been hard feelings. I'm someone with a channel that focuses on Pathfinder 2nd Edition, but I'm playing, and I want to play more, tabletop RPGs. And I think it's cool that there are prominent new systems that are trying new things. A lot of these new ideas could be good for players and also inform a future potential Pathfinder 3rd Edition. And I think that the analogy to the 1990s doesn't hold up. Campaign settings splitting up a shrinking pie as opposed to a growing one is very different. In the 1990s, which I lived through, there appeared to be a cultural shift away from analog gaming towards digital gaming. Advances in technology and video game consoles and computers were attracting a lot of people who were playing tabletop games who could have those calculations done by a computer and also didn't have to deal with the inconvenience of gathering a group of people together. Also, tabletop gaming didn't necessarily die, but rather diversified. There was an explosion of collectible card games spearheaded by Magic the Gathering, and also the beginnings of the modern board game revolution going on in the 1990s. Now I think that a lot of these factors are moving forward in favor of the growth of tabletop role-playing games, which then gets me to talk about why I think there is a boom in interest in tabletop role-playing games today, which Ben Riggs doesn't really pin down, I think. First, I don't think Ben Riggs thinks that the OGL is the reason for this boom in interest. People who want to check out D&D will buy D&D and not buy a third-party source book as their first purchase. Nor do I think that saying Stranger Things and Critical Role happened is an adequate answer. Yes, they drove a lot of interest in Dungeons & Dragons, but I think that they're part of an overall bigger cultural shift. There's a reason why they resonate with audiences. Ben Riggs assigns importance to D&D's brand recognition. He says that people check out Critical Role for this reason. He says, for years, Critical Role's pitch was watch voice actors play D&D, a concept even my 80-year-old Aunt Sonia understands. Now the pitch is watch voice actors play Candela Obscura. But what is Candela Obscura? If asked, Aunt Sonia might guess Candela Obscura was a potpourri scent, and I must say that's a fair point. The brand recognition that drove people to Critical Role is gone. And to this, I would say that the appeal of Critical Role is not D&D. To be honest, this is my experience. I don't claim it's everyone's experience, but when combat starts or they get into rules questions, my interest kind of wanes. This is not to diss D&D. If it were any other system, I think that statement would still be true. People watch Critical Role to watch a group of friends playing pretend and being very talented at that, having fun, acting out as characters, and creating a story. Now, if Critical Role were to switch to their own Daggerheart system, which is not confirmed, I think Ben Riggs and all of us would still tell our Aunt Sonia's, hey, you gotta watch this show, it's voice actors playing D&D. And if Aunt Sonia watches it and likes it, well, she'll have no idea that it's not D&D, and she probably won't care. So why the boom in interest in TTRPGs? Well, some of this stuff I'll say is not going to be news to people. First, there's a rise of geek culture. This is general knowledge. In the 1980s, with the Satanic Panic, D&D was confined to basements and viewed as the province of nerds. There was a social stigma to playing that nerdy game. Now, starting, I think, around the year 2000 or so, there's been a steady growing interest in sci-fi and fantasy in television and film. We now have top money-making blockbuster movie franchises based on characters that used to be confined to comic books. Video games are no longer perceived as just the province of children, but played by adult enthusiasts worldwide. People make entire careers streaming themselves playing video games now. I also would venture to say that the younger generations are less, quote, grown up, unquote. There's a common saying, which I found out researching this video, came from the Bible, that when I became a man, I put away childish things. I think that sentiment is quite passé with people under 40, or over 40 for that matter. Like, come on, we live in a time when Halloween is not just for kids anymore, and I live in San Francisco where there's an annual dress up as Santa convention. And what I've seen, my experience running a after-school middle school class from 2012 to 2019, and also doing private game mastering for the kids I met in that class, is that there is a real rise in interest in social analog gaming. The kids, of course, were completely all into playing games, but also their parents were very supportive and wanted their kids to get away from screens and also find ways that were away from video games to socialize with their friends. And this is not confined to kids. There's been a huge interest in tabletop gaming, especially in board games, that is seen by the growth of the board game cafe. And often tabletop role-playing games are seen there played side by side next to board games. There's a wonderful board game cafe in Berkeley, California called Victory Point Cafe that I often hang out at. Board games are now an adult activity that people go out with their friends to play while drinking. In the 1990s, I described a move away from analog gaming towards digital as technology advanced, but I would say that there now is a counterwave happening before our eyes, where people want to maintain human connections and not get lost on their phone. Now, much of tabletop role-playing game nowadays is done online, but even then, that cooperative and social aspect is unrivaled and not matched by any other medium. So I would say that D&D and tabletop role-playing games in general are not simply the domain of young people as they were in the 1980s and 90s. They are now part of an overall interest among people of most ages in genre fiction, interpersonal interaction, and gaming. The show Stranger Things was not some accident. It was greenlit in the first place because people who grew up in the 1980s were entering their prime spending years, and the show catered to 80s nostalgia. And also, audiences were ready for a show with cosmic horror, sci-fi, and fantasy. The show reflects just as much as it reinforces this cultural shift. So, if the company that makes D&D happens to falter, I don't see the growth in interest in tabletop role-playing games stopping. And this is all why I think we are actually entering a new golden age. And I opened by saying, well, a golden age is is subjective. It's whether you like the new change. And I would say change is happening and I like it. My criterion is not whether it's possible to establish a business supporting a game and company that has a near monopoly position. I think we need to look at the experience of players. And there's a surge of interest and a continuing influx of new people who want to play tabletop games. That's great. We're seeing prominent new tabletop role-playing games that are not D&D succeeding, and that means greater competition, which is good for consumers. If there's only one system that dominates the market, there is a tendency for the company that publishes that system to take its players for granted, and especially dungeon masters, and a tendency for that game to stagnate. Why fix something that's already making a lot of money? Having more systems instead of just the one means that everybody needs to up their game. Dungeons and Discourse made a great point in her video. The growth of a near monopoly by Hasbro in the TTRPG space led to a situation where they felt that they could try to destroy competition by revoking the OGL and try to, and they may still try to, aggressively monetize the customers. Next, as someone who's been promoting Pathfinder 2e on my channel, it's just really awesome seeing a lot of people who once only played D&D 5e now have greater interest in and wanting to check out other systems. And that includes not just Pathfinder, but also MCDM, DC-20, Tales of the Valiant, old school systems, Powered by the Apocalypse systems. Exposure to more systems I advocate for everybody in the hobby. It exposes you to the limitations and also strengths of your first system. You can see that there are different ways that different systems have figured out to handle things, and this is good for the entire hobby. People's overall knowledge is increasing. Hell, there's surely going to be more people joining the hobby via D&D's virtual tabletop, which we all know Hasbro will heavily promote. Even if the VTT flounders and goes offline, those people won't simply disappear. On the publisher side, Paizo, in response to the OGL scandal, spearheaded the creation of the ORC license, the Open RPG Creative license that allows designers to share their work, and already major publishers such as Chaosium and Cobalt Press have joined Paizo and many others in putting their designs out into their own kind of Creative Commons. This creates more opportunities for other publishers to create supportive material for those games, or publish their own RPG systems that borrow mechanics that have been created by others without the fear of being sued by them. And with the rise of the internet and crowdfunding, we now as players have an unprecedented ability to tell designers what we want for our games. So, closing statement. I'm actually glad Ben Riggs posted this article because I think a year after the OGL crisis, it is good for the community to have a reckoning of what we've accomplished and where we're at. There is change happening in the TTRPG space, and there might be setbacks for certain companies, but as we all know, it's the nature of life that when there are setbacks, there is change. In D&D's darkest times in the 1990s, when the company TSR that published D&D almost went into bankruptcy, it was buoyed up by the purchase of Wizards of the Coast. Wizards of the Coast did not get that money from nowhere. What happened was the industry of tabletop gaming was growing with the huge influx of people into Magic the Gathering, and that meant more money for publishers. D&D's perhaps aged design, having been not changed much since 1974, was updated with 3rd edition in 2000, which saw a new surge of interest in D&D and a growth in third-party publishing. as well as growth in the overall TTRPG industry. When Wizards of the Coast tried with 4th edition to move away from the OGL and also canceled its contract with Paizo Publishing, which had been producing Dungeon and Dragon magazines, Paizo came out with Pathfinder role-playing game, and Wizards of the Coast lost its claim to dominance. And I need to point out, if we're going to point to historical precedents, that's probably the more appropriate thing to compare to. Now, I wouldn't say that the market grew in those next few years. Maybe it did, I don't know. But it did mean that Wizards of the Coast lost its comfortable position being the market leader and kind of had to up its own game with D&D 5th edition, which is liked by many, as shown by the fact in, yes, the massive growth in players in the past 10 years. 5e's approachability for new players compared to previous editions definitely helped in that regard. So setbacks, vicissitudes, they're momentary. What matters much more is the overall cultural shift that we're going through and that we're seeing in the growth in geek culture, board game cafes, interest in face-to-face or analog gaming. From the standpoint of players in these games, times have rarely been this golden. And together we just went through a tremendous positive change. A year ago, the entire hobby united against Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast and succeeded in toppling their arrogant effort to monopolize the hobby. The most important change that came with the OGL crisis was that many of us changed. Many people in the hobby realized that they don't need D&D or any one company in order to play Imagination with math rocks. You can't aggressively monetize a hobby that's essentially people gathering together to play pretend. Now everyone, including Wizards of the Coast, has to do better to satisfy a now more discerning market that demands and wants and deserves better. Now, I won't go so far as to say that Ben Riggs is some apologist or shill for Wizards of the Coast. He's not. He clearly shows some healthy skepticism of Wizards' plans going forward. But I must say that the idea that the success of alternative systems to D&D through these recent crowdfunding campaigns, which reflect how far we've come as a community after successfully defending the OGL, that pretends doom, is frankly absurd. And it contradicts what many of us were fighting for in January 2023 in the first place. So that's it. I've been Ronald the Rules Lawyer. I hope you've enjoyed this rebuttal. If you did, like and subscribe. Also, support my ability to continue making videos by supporting my Patreon. You get early access to videos and exclusive content. And also join my growing Discord community. We're almost at 5,000. Mostly people interested in Pathfinder 2e, but also just like talking about gaming. It's also a chance to play Pathfinder as we have a drop-in, drop-out organized play system for the game. So that's it. I've been Ronald the Rules Lawyer. I hope you enjoyed the video. I'll see you next time.